5:01, let's call the meeting to order. Sandy, roll call, please.
Dale Delkey, Rachel Henderson, Mark Hillman,
Here.
Carl Palmer, Amy Riddle Swanson,
Here.
Charlie Schneider,
Here.
Angie Skillings,
Here.
Abe Smith,
Here.
Dominique Stewart.
Here.
Okay, quorum is established. Let's move to the budget hearing itself. Joe, you want to tee it up?
Will do. Thanks, Charlie. And thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you for anybody who's joining virtually. Tonight is a special night, and twice a year, the board dedicates an entire meeting just to talk about the budget. The budget is talked about pretty much every meeting throughout the school year, but at the annual meeting in August, and then at this mid-year budget hearing in January, we take some extra time to review budget items, look at demographics and trends, and try to make sure we have a very clear understanding of the budget for our school district. This is not a required meeting by law. The annual meeting in August is, but this is something that the school board has chosen to do now for several years in an effort to not only predict and look at our budget, but also to be very transparent with the community about funding mechanisms in our school district. Our business manager, Director of Business Services, Leah Theater, will be conducting most of this budget presentation. I will be jumping in with some additional comments from time to time. So with that being said, Leah, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, first off, we'll discuss the total budget. The total budget includes several major funding categories and hundreds of line items.
Leah, I'm sorry, could you pull the microphone a little closer to you just so that people can hear you? Thank you.
The total budget for the school district for 22-23 school year is approximately $63.6 million. School finances are impacted by many factors such as state laws and mandates, student enrollment, property valuations, capital expenses, grants, and salary and benefits, along with other categories like federal funding, etc. Key dates in our budgeting process. We start out the year in August with our annual meeting and budget hearing. In September, we have our third Friday membership count, which drives, is part of the formula for our state revenues. In October, our state aid calculations are released, and the board adopts the final budget for the year and sets the tax levy. In November, that is the deadline to certify our tax levy to municipality clerks. In January, we have our second Friday membership count and also our mid-year budget hearing. In February, the board begins discussions for next year's budget, so that would be the 23-24 preliminary budget estimate. In May, the board discusses the 23-24 preliminary budget, and then in June, the board sets or approves the 23-24 preliminary budget and schedules the annual meeting and budget hearing.
Now this year, we are going to be entering into a new biennium with the state budget, and every time we do that, every 2 years, it gets a little more challenging for budgeting because so much can change in Madison in terms of how schools are funded. And we've talked about this, going into this next biennium is going to be more unique than really any of the past bienniums in recent memory due to the fact that schools in Wisconsin essentially were directed to use federal COVID monies to operate the past 2 years. There really was no additional funding from the state. So we know that there's the potential for a fiscal cliff. The good news is that our state budget situation is in really good shape with a large surplus, but we're going to be paying very close attention to Madison when it comes to our budgeting and trying to predict what kind of revenue we'll have for the next 2 years.
Wisconsin School Finance, the revenue limits per pupil adjustments are as follows. They were $175 for the 1920 school year, $179 for 2021, and $0 for 21-22, and also 22-23. The previous 4 years were frozen, and as Joe mentioned, we're in the second year of the biennial budget, and so what's to come for the next 2 years for that budget has yet to be released, but that should be coming out this next year. The low revenue ceiling is set at $10,000 with no increase for 21-22 and 22-23. General state aid and school levy credits, the past 5 years overall average has increased approximately 3%. While that funding is not spendable without a revenue limit increase.
Leah, if you don't mind, I'll jump in on that. And then that's a note that we wanted to include. A lot of times in the media, when the state budget is passed, you'll see that the state has invested millions and more dollars into state aids, or in some cases, school levy credits. And while that funding is tied to education, really it's tied to education in name only. Unless there is a corresponding increase to revenue limit, increasing state aid or increasing school levy credits does not provide any additional spendable revenue for the school district. It is beneficial for property taxpayers because the more of our funding that comes from state aid, the less on the local property tax burden. But nevertheless, if there's not a revenue limit increase, that revenue just offsets taxes. It does not provide any additional revenue for school programming or anything we're doing here in the schools.
Next is the per pupil aid. That is frozen at $742 per pupil. That was set for the 21-22 school year and also 22-23. And that amount is unknown for the next biennial budget. And then the special education categorical aid, which is based on estimated eligible costs, increased from 29.6% last year to 30% this year. The next slide is our enrollment history. Student enrollment, you'll see for the past 5 years, it's kind of gone up and down. This school year, it's gone down slightly over last year. The enrollment projections for the next 5 years, the forecast model is showing relatively flat enrollment. It kind of goes up and down in each of the years. This can be hard to predict, but that's the best forecast we have at this time for enrollment projections.
To comment on enrollment, a couple things. These projections really are based on cast forward projections. You know, we take our kindergarten class and move them up a year to first grade and the next year to second grade, and that gives us a pretty good idea. So the first couple of years are usually pretty accurate, but then once we start getting out 3, 4, 5 years, it gets much more difficult to predict. You know, typically our 4-year-old kindergarten classes are between 200 and 250 students. We watch that very closely each year, and that would give us more information in terms of what our enrollment projections will be. One of the reasons why enrollment is towards the beginning of this presentation is that our funding is largely driven on student enrollment. And what you can see from this future enrollment projection is our enrollment is predicted to be relatively stable. And that's a good thing. That helps with budgeting, it helps with programming, as opposed to some school districts where enrollment may fluctuate one way or another. That requires significant changes, especially with staffing. So this looks good, but it is, again, I want to classify this as it is hard to predict. And it seems like with more emphasis on other educational options, it's becoming more and more difficult to predict than what it used to be. Whether we're talking about homeschool, private school, things like that. So we do need to keep a close track on student enrollment.
I would say also the demographics have a lot to do with it too. We're seeing it at the college level. traditional college student, there's not as many coming through, so we have to find other opportunities. And of course, in the school district, you can't do that, but we're trying to find other opportunities at the college level, like, non-traditional students and so forth, but, yeah.
Yeah, and with the pandemic, we saw a big fluctuation. I'll move back a slide. You can see in 2020, 2021, even though a high percentage of our students continued with the district, whether it be when we were offering instruction in person or virtual, it definitely was a dip. But what we can be thankful for in Menomonie, I think Amy, you were alluding to this a little bit, we've known for a long time that the demographics of Wisconsin, and really the country for that matter, is a changing demographic. And as our country and as our region ages, concerns about declining enrollment have been shared and continue to be shared. We're fortunate in Menomonie to have stable enrollment.
Property values for our school district, this again is a 5-year history on that, and you can see each year it has gone up slightly each year. Between last year and this year, it went up more than the other years. It's just kind of the environment we're living in right now.
And we're not going to try to go into all the complexities of state aid, but property value does impact our state aid. The percentage of aid, it really comes down to property value per member, but also as property value increases, that lowers the mill rate and spreads the burden, but it all depends on the individual valuation. If your property gets reassessed and the valuation goes up, then you would expect the taxes to go up as well, but that can change in both directions.
And then if we take a look at our tax rate history, our mill rate for this year has gone down. It's at 6.07, which is a decrease of 1.64 or approximately 21.31% from last year. If you look at the chart, the gray section is the general fund 10 levy portion. The red is our ref from approved debt service, which is our fund 39. And then the little bit in blue is, the bright blue is community service, and then property tax chargebacks is so small you can't see that on the slide. But this is just a graph of showing you how the mill rate is broken down by the different categories.
And it should be no surprise that general fund expenses are the largest factor contributing to the mill rate in our overall tax levy.
And then we took a look at our mill rate in comparison to the region. You'll see the average mill rate for the group is 7.25. We are down towards the bottom there. We're at 6.07. Some are above the average, majority though below the average. And then if we take a look at the Wisconsin Parental Choice Program and Special Needs Scholarship Program, those are two programs that were created at the state, and they provide funding for eligible students attending a participating private school. The Special Needs Program allows a student with a disability who meets certain eligibility requirements to receive a state-funded scholarship to attend SNSP school. In 22-23, SDMA had 2 private schools participating in the program. In the WPCP program, there was a combined total of 54.6 FTE students, and in the SNSP program, there was 8 FTE students. And so the total financial impact on the school district is $563,839. Resident districts receive a non-recurring revenue limit adjustment equal to that FTE choice payment, which allows the resident district to replace the reduction in the general state aid through an increase in property taxes.
So that number is $563,839.
Taken right off the general fund, correct?
Correct, the state aid, yep.
So out of our general fund to take care of students in private schools.
Yes. And then the tax levy is increased in a non-recurring manner to recoup those dollars.
This is a graph in our equalization aid history, and you'll see, for the most part, it's been increasing over the past 5 years, but I think the biggest takeaway from this slide is just to know that an increase in the general aid is a decrease in the tax levy. So as your aid goes up, your levy goes down. As your levy goes up, your aid goes down.
And that's a good point. When we look at the mill rate slide, I'm going to go back to that for a second. You can see how the mill rate has dropped in our district. That's not because our district is under levying. We have levied to our revenue limit each year. It's really more of a function of the revenue limits being frozen and state aid being increased. It's not that our school district is not raising the revenue that we're allowed to by law. It's just a function of how our schools are being funded. It is worth noting, though, that the decisions that are made by the board do impact state aid, and again, it's quite complicated. But for example, at the end of the last budget year, the board had a decision to make because revenues were more than expenditures at that time. And the board decided to transfer those dollars into Fund 46, which we'll talk about, the capital improvement fund. And by doing that, those dollars became aidable, which means essentially it was almost like they were spent on an item. In fact, they were when they were transferred into that fund. Those dollars are in that fund and then able to be expended for qualifying capital improvement expenses. But by doing that and making those dollars spendable and aidable, that increases the state aid for our school. And the board has done that many times over the last several years, whether it be transferring dollars into our post-employment benefit trust, Fund 73, or into the capital improvement fund, as opposed to having those dollars go to fund balance where they would not be aidable and we would not be maximizing our state aid. So some very good decisions by the board have increased state aid and lowered the mill rate.
If we take a look at our operating budget of revenues and expenses, the 21-22 school year, our actual figures compared to our budget numbers this year, the revenues changed just slightly at $1,525, which totaled a 0% given the overall size of our budget. But expenditures increased almost 2.8 million or 6.66%.
And looking at this slide, you would think that we were going to be operating in a deficit situation this school year. However, this was a planned event, and it really has to do with the federal COVID funding, which will be replacing what normally would be general fund revenue. So that $2.7 million is expected, that gap is expected to be closed with the use of federal COVID funding. We are anticipating a balanced budget by the end of the school year.
And then this is just a chart of our fund balance over the past 5 years. Like Joe mentioned, the general fund balance will likely remain the same due to the additional ESSER grant funding. We expect to balance the budget. So this chart really is just between last year to this year, the amounts haven't changed a whole lot. Just to kind of, the slide, the blue portion of the slide is the unassigned fund balance, and that is used for just the general budget. The assigned portion in red is primarily the amount assigned to our self-funded health insurance. There is a small piece of that that's also for or designated for the common school funds, which are our library funds. Any amount unspent from the prior year has to be assigned to the library in the next year. So that's a very small portion, it's around $20,000. And then our next chart is our Fund 30 debt service payments. You'll see in 2021, that was our highest amount. We had a refinancing that year, which is why it jumped up. But you'll see because of that refinancing, our payments have gone down. And it's been set up so they remain relatively the same until 33, 34, when we pay off that debt.
And Leah and the business office has done a terrific job over the years. I believe it was over $7 million that has been saved in terms of interest compared to what would have been projected at the time of the referendum through refinancing and decisions related to our debt. Now this is 39 debt, so it's referendum debt outside the revenue limit. The district did carry Fund 38 debt for a while, and that was debt that is underneath the revenue limit, but that has all been paid off, and the remaining debt is outside the revenue limit.
What's the distinction between what counts and doesn't count for debt versus revenue limit? Like, what's the legal distinction in Fund 30 and 38?
Well, the biggest distinction is that for debt to be outside the revenue limit, you have to have a referendum. And the recent, I think it's 2013, when the district passed the referendum to upgrade buildings and facilities, that was a large portion of the 39 debt.
And then our Fund 46, which is our long-term capital improvement fund. This is a 5-year history again of the fund balance in that account. And Fund 60 was established after we did that referendum to save up for future maintenance costs and other long-term capital improvement costs into the future. And so you'll see our fund balance as of June 30th, 22 has risen to $7.8 million.
And tonight the board will be reviewing the 30-year capital improvement plan. And there are a number of projects that are underway, so we don't expect this to continue to grow as it had. There is a 5-year waiting period, which we're now beyond since the creation of the fund. And as our facilities continue to age, more and more attention is needed. So, Leah, you might have said Fund 60 at one point, but we are, I think it's just a slip. We are
Fund 46.
Yeah, there's a lot of numbers we're talking about, but it is Fund 46, just to clarify.
Okay, and then Community Service Fund 80. Again, this is our 5-year history for the tax levy for that fund. And you'll see the last 2 years that levy has remained the same. And for the Community Service Fund, that includes middle school athletics, pool field house, community education, and also a resource officer.
And the Community Service Fund, Fund 80, is outside the revenue limit. In fact, I'm just going to refer back to that previous slide. You can see there that the red portion of our mill rate, no, that's the wrong. The blue portion of our mill rate shows the impact of Fund 80 outside the revenue limit. It's a very small part of our mill rate.
Sorry, Leah, could you repeat what was in Fund 80? There's a variety of things: athletics, community service officer.
Middle school athletics, the Boys and Girls Club, community education offerings, which includes pool field house, that kind of thing.
So for the resource officer, that's a partnership with the county.
The cities, yeah.
I'm sorry, the city. How is revenue split between how is the funding of that position split between the district and the city?
Yeah, there's an agreement with the city, and I believe it's 60-40. I want to look at it. I haven't looked at it in the last few weeks, but yeah, there's a split revenue there, and our portion of it would be in Fund 80.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
And post-employment benefits, which is our Fund 73. The school district provides local post-employment benefits for most of our full-time employees. It includes health insurance, contributions to an HRA account, and cash stipends. Fund 73 is our post-employment benefit trust fund. And we have, over the years, worked really hard on lowering our unfunded liability. So the total OPEB pension liability as of June 22 is at 8.1 million. I believe last year it was at 9.7 million. So that is coming down considerably. The fund balance in that account is 6.7 million. We did not make any additional contribution to our trust fund this year. The 1.5 million is our net OPEB or pension liability, which is unfunded. Now, the majority of this is all on the pension side. Our OPEB liability is actually totally funded. In fact, our assets were about 51,000 higher than what needs to be funded. And so moving forward, our actuarial each year will take a look at our OPEB fund and determine if next year it'll be fully funded or not. It just depends on what the costs are, number of retirees, etc. So that will go up and down, but it's important to note that we're at a point now where it's becoming fully funded. And then overall, the anticipated payments for the next 30 years, it looks like 9.4 million. And then this is just a graph on our OPEB benefits paid and projected. The blue line there is the total number of retirees that we currently have, and that's 82. And then the total paid is the bar in red, and you'll see back in 1819, our total payments, actual payments, were quite high in comparison to this year. They're just over $1 million compared to about 1.9 million, I would say, back in 1819.
And this graph is another good example of wise decisions that the board made. You know, the number of retirees in 2022, 2023 is actually more than it was in 2010, 2011. Yet you can see the expenses are significantly different between those 2 years. And certainly wasn't easy making changes, but in looking at the projections and seeing what the expenses were going to be in the future, I think you can see the benefits of the wise decision making by the board.
And then salary and benefits, they are the largest expenditure on our school district budget. It's approximately 75%. Again, we've tried to stay very competitive with comparable school districts in our region. The CPI for 22-23 increased 4.7%. But in addition to that, the various groups also received their steps, so it was higher, as you know, than the 4.7. Staffing costs are increasing, as you probably well know, due to market factors, inflation, employee shortages, etc. But as Joe said, we have made changes in our district self-funded plan, which have helped mitigate rapidly increasing health insurance costs.
Yeah, and even with the changes, I think board members know that starting January 1st, we did have some plan design changes, and for the first time in over 5 years, we had to increase our premiums. Without the changes, we wouldn't be able to mitigate the increasing health insurance costs, but I think by doing that, our hope is that it should stabilize our fund and continue it being viable moving forward. But inflation certainly is a concern, not just with schools, but all across the economy, and it's going to continue to be a challenge, especially when funding is not predictable and it hasn't kept up with inflation. Right now the CPI is running close to 8% for for next year's bargaining, and we don't necessarily have a collective bargaining group that's certified here. However, schools around the region, if we're talking about trying to stay competitive, we can expect a pretty challenging year with salary and benefit increases.
And this chart is our health insurance. The red bars shows what the total cost of premiums are that we pay each year. So you'll see the last 2 years, that's been running just over $6 million. And then for the last 6 years, we have not increased premiums. But you'll see the green line bar on top is the cost of a family plan, and then the blue line bar running across is the cost of our single plan. And as Joe mentioned, we did increase those rates January 1st of this year.
And we're going to have to keep a real close eye on health insurance moving forward. It's still kind of questionable as to what has been behind the increasing costs. Certainly inflation is a part of it. We also know that people deferring care and procedures during the pandemic has led to a backlog of care needed, and in some cases the care has become more expensive and more comprehensive. And I guess the real question is going to be, is the trend going to continue, or is it kind of playing catch up from the pandemic? That'll have a significant impact on our fund and our programming as we move forward from year to year.
So just clarification on this chart that we were looking at. The blue and the green, that's the district portion or the total or the
Overall total
overall total? Okay, thank you.
per month. Our grant funding this year, the Margaret A. Cargill grant we have listed here, that's a grant period from 2020 through 23, so a 3-year period. That grant award total is $485,000. We also received a school health services, a workforce development center grant this school year for a total award of $29,440. We also received the Special Education Transition Incentive Grant. This school year, that grant total award is $15,287. And then we also received, for the second year in a row, the Get Kids Ahead initiative, and that was a grant total award of $54,632.
And I think it's important to point out that these are just some of the major grants. We also received grants from the Anne Marie Foundation, the Rotary Club of Menomonie. I'm sure we could think of more, but we just kind of classified some of the more substantial grants for this presentation.
And then if we look at our federal grant funding, this is just a breakdown, again, over the past 5 years. You'll see like Title I has decreased about approximately 5% over the past 5 years. Title II, 7% decrease. Title III has gone up 1%. Title IV has gone up 13%. And then Carl Perkins, our vocational education grant, has 2%. So we wanted to include these slides just to show you that the federal grant funding overall is starting to decrease over the past 5 years. So we just thought it important to share that information.
Yeah, this is coming to a head. Much of our title funding is used in our intervention services for students, and because of the reduction in federal funding, our local revenue has had to replace that. So, not only are we dealing with inflation and the cost of these services increasing, the funding to support these programming services makes it difficult to continue with them. So as we look at our staffing plan and as we look at our budget for future years, this reduction in federal grant funding is something we'll have to keep in mind.
Is this reduction in federal grant funding consistent with like other Wisconsin and?
Rachel, could you please use your microphone so people can hear you that when they're not here?
Are the decrease in federal grant funding is what we're seeing consistent with what other schools are seeing? In other words, is it consistent across the state of the country, or is denominated?
You know, Brian knows this as much as anybody. You're shaking your head. Yes, Brian, that's what I would agree with as well. Thanks for, yes, the answer is yes. Thanks for.
Sorry, yeah. Yes, it's consistent with other schools around the country.
Yes.
And the next slide is the federal IDEA, or special education funding. And there again, you'll see the IDEA flow-through has gone up slightly, 1%. And then the IDEA preschool again has dropped about 3%.
Again, consistent with other schools.
Correct. And then our COVID-19 funding, we just have a breakdown here between all the different funding sources. We had the initial ESSER 1 and then ESSER 2 and 3. In addition to that, we were awarded the CARES Act CRP for a total award last year of $448,892. And then this year, we received the ARPA Back to School aid, which was awarded in August. So that was a total aid award of $305,991.
And again, I think we already mentioned this, but a portion of these funds were used to help the school district mitigate the pandemic. Some examples would be additional custodians, additional nurses, virtual school teachers, full-time substitutes, things of that matter. But many of these funds have been used just to operate. And again, that's a decision that the state made for this biennium, that schools would need to use these funds to essentially supplant what typically would be funded through the state funding formula and the revenue limit, which has really helped our state budget, but has also created this fiscal cliff. And you know, at the time, it was said that this would be planned for, and schools could expect additional funding after the COVID funding ran out. But now the rubber hits the road, and with the next biennial budget, we're hopeful that funding will be replaced. In some very rough calculations, we're predicting that it's going to take about $1,000 per student in the first year of the biennium to continue with our current programming, and then an additional $500 in the second year of the biennium. I'm hopeful that we'll see funding in that range. So Leah, thank you for providing those slides and that update. Certainly our schools are a very important part of our community, and I know that I feel that our schools are very well supported by our community, not only through the local property tax levy, but in so many other ways where community members support what we're doing here, not only financially, but also just supporting programming in general. We really do appreciate the support. Without that kind of support, we would not be able to offer our students with the terrific educational experience that they receive here. And we plan and hope to continue to provide these services moving forward. We do have a few minutes, so at this time, if anybody would like to ask a question or provide any additional comments, we're all ears. Anybody? I know questions were asked along the way too, so.
Charlie, is there anything you want to add if you can still hear us?
Yes, I can still hear you, and no, I have nothing to add. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Joe. Well done.
Thanks, Charlie, and thank you, board members. Last call. Anything anybody would like to share in regards to the mid-year budget hearing? Charlie, hearing none and seeing none, if you would like to adjourn this meeting, we'll get ready for our 5:45 regular meeting.
I think that's a great idea. We'd entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
I'll second.
So you have a motion by Amy and a second by Mark.
Okay, we stand adjourned.
Very good. We'll take a 5-minute break and then we'll get started with our regular meeting. Thanks, everyone.